Welcome. My name is Michael Harris Love. I'm the director of the University of Colorado Physical Therapy Program, and I'm joined by colleagues Dr. Mike Body and Dr. Jen Stevens-Lapsley. We're talking to you today about PhD and postdoctoral training. I'll start with the section pertaining to historically Black colleges and universities, and then Dr. Stevens-Lapsley and Dr. Body will talk more broadly about the value proposition of PhD and postdoctoral training, as well as some elements that portend to success when pursuing that avenue of education. So allow me to share my screen. And Jen, you can confirm if you're able to see that fine?
Yep, looks
Good.
Great.
Thanks. So let's go ahead and begin. So just by way of introduction, I think the context is everything when talking about a topic like this. So I'm from the inner city of East Detroit, did not grow up knowing much about HBCUs. And I recall being a high school senior and talking to a friend, and he mentioned that he was moving down south and he was going to pursue a mathematics degree at Fisk University, and that he was insistent on being a Fisk man and being part of the Fisk family. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I didn't know why he was moving down south. I wondered what was wrong with Wayne State or Michigan State. And so I had a lot to learn. And I think that small story really talks about the broad movement of the Black community that really dates back to the Great Migration. 6 million Black Americans moving to the North and other parts of the US, in part to gain some economic mobility, but also losing some of the civic and educational institutions that were essential to Black life. I'm happy to report that I did learn more about the HBCU system, having moved to Washington, D.C. And so I worked with Howard University. So in part, my training grant was a joint grant between the VA system and Howard University. I was able to serve as an adjunct within the physical therapy program, and then also participate in helping to train PhD students and also put forward research at that institution. And so it was a great education on many fronts. So today I want to talk to you briefly about the HBCU legacy, which is rich and long, the HBCU challenge as it relates to postdoctoral and doctoral education, and also advantages of being part of that system. And keep in mind, there's a lot of research about HBCUs, but much less in terms of doctoral and postdoctoral study within these great institutions. So I've tried to draw upon the research I was able to find to talk about this topic. Let's start with the great untold story about HBCUs, and that's that they are a major driver of Black economic mobility. And so we're looking at a graph from the McKinsey Institute where we're defining mobility rate as students that start at the bottom 20% of income distribution with their families, and then ascending to the top 20% of income distribution after graduating from their institutions. And you'll see that HBCU institutions almost do twice as well as non-HBCU institutions regarding the economic mobility of their students. And in part, this really draws from the communities in which HBCU serves. And so many of the students do come from economically disadvantaged areas. And so access to education is one of the key roles for the HBCU. So when we hear talk about, is there a place for the HBCU anymore? I think that this answers the question. Other important thing is that the HBCUs really have an outsized role in the education of Black Americans relative to their size. And it's an interesting point when we focus on doctoral and postdoctoral education. I think that there's a perception that there is now a glut of PhD programs over the past couple of decades. We can also have a separate conversation about the inflation of credentials among our professions in terms of the doctorate. But taking all of that aside, doctoral education still represents a small slice of the population in terms of those who pursue that line of study. And underrepresented minorities are even a smaller slice than that. And so again, HBCUs can help fill the gap in this vital area. So in thinking about the challenges, these challenges are real. The one thing to keep in mind is that independent of institution tuition, HBCU students have much more federal debt than students at non-HBCU institutions. And this is really related to the well-documented racial gap, particularly among Black Americans. Another challenge that we have to deal with is that the under-resourcing of some of the institutions. And so endowments are much smaller compared to non-HBCU institutions. So these issues have been on the radar for the federal government in recent years. And so the White House convened an initiative to examine these more fully before thinking about some funding solutions. And so here are some of the things that they found in their study. One is that they cited a high turnover of senior leadership and admin staff at these institutions. They also cited the proper utilization of Title IV funding or student aid funding at institutions, and also adequate support of IT resources in regards to capacity, student privacy, and other issues. Now, we're very familiar in the media of a longstanding critique of HBCUs and should they still exist. But I have to say, in looking at some of the student survey data and talking to students on my own at Howard, some student survey data also mirror these concerns. So some of these concerns are certainly real. But I think it has to be balanced with the value of the institution. I mean, after all, students that attend these institutions, they do their homework, and the students I know, they're well aware of some of these issues, but they choose to attend the HBCU anyway. And so why is that the case? I think a lot of it could be summarized in social capital. And that social capital emanates from the positive interactions that students have with their faculty and peers. And that feeds into the inherent trust that's been built over for many years, and trust not only on an institutional level, but also within the communities where these institutions live. And all of this feeds into a decreased sense of student social isolation, which we all know, for the educators on the call, that this is essential to academic success, particularly in demanding programs. And I think that one element that affirms the social capital and intellectual capital at HBCUs are the graduates who choose to teach at HBCUs upon finishing their doctorates. So we mentioned HBCUs serving underserved communities or places where there may be economic disparities. And so sometimes that might engender some misunderstanding about students being able to afford graduate study or postdoctoral studies. So it's incumbent upon the educators on this call to share the message that the funding mechanism for undergrad study is very different than the funding mechanisms for graduate study. And this is the point that the other presenters will touch on in more detail. When you think back to an institution that extends to the antebellum South, you have to reflect on the evolution over time. Like, yes, there's a legacy, but there's also growth. And so when we talk about our choices for doctoral and postdoctoral study, we want to think about the traditional HBCU, but also other developments. Again, students like myself who grew up in the Rust Belt, minority serving institutions that might be a state institution or a city institution are a valuable part of the network of universities that can sustain doctoral education. And likewise now, majority institutions are striving to have a more diverse student population. And so certainly that's an avenue for students to pursue. But I think what's most exciting is that over the past 10 to 20 years, the combined forces of HBCUs and alliances with other universities in the region have been a great boon to students who are seeking doctoral or postdoctoral education. And these alliances allow for students to have mentors at their HBCU to maintain their social networks while also availing themselves of the resources of other institutions in the area. And so this is definitely an area of development to watch. Briefly, there are many funding mechanisms for students who are pursuing the PhD or postdoctoral education. The top one in terms of the NIH Diversity Supplement is perhaps the best known, but I wanted to point out a couple that are less known, and that's the Minority Serving Institution Research Scientist Award through the VA, as well as the new diversity supplement they have that somewhat parallels what we've seen at NIH for many years. So these are exciting but underutilized mechanisms that trainees should definitely try to find out more about, and we can talk about that offline as well. The last link there shows another resource for those interested in postdoctoral training to find individual fellowships and resources to support their educational efforts. As we kind of wrap up this part of the talk, I did want to talk about elements that really help you find a good fellowship, and elements that instructors and supervisors should also be mindful of to have a complete and thorough fellowship experience. And so there's many frameworks to use. This one framework I'm showing you is from the National Postdoctoral Association, and there are things that you would expect, right? And that's the discipline-specific knowledge that you're going to the institution to learn, and research skill development. But there are also some intrinsic skills too, like being a better communicator in regards to science, or the progressive growth of lab management and leadership that also comes from the doctoral and postdoctoral experience. And all of these institutions should have some training in the responsible conduct of research, but hopefully they go beyond just human subjects protections, and also talk about ethical and I guess the practice of authorship, to think about the fidelity of data and the management of data. And there are many elements to that. But the final piece I really wanted to focus on for a moment, and that's professionalism. And certainly I'm a believer of professionalism when you think about scientific communication and interprofessional skills that you need to exhibit in a lab. And for those of us who are clinicians, we obviously have to serve the public interest and contribute to our specialized body of knowledge. All these constitutes professionalism. But what doesn't constitute professionalism is weaponizing the term for things like one's hair or dress that's related to racial ethnic background. These things are also concerns of students of color. And so I think it's incumbent of all of us in the institutions that we serve, or institutions you might be looking at for study, to understand the culture of the institution. There is a acculturation process to taking on a new job or entering a lab, and we want to make sure it's true professionalism and not weaponized professionalism. So in summary, again, HBCUs are a huge economic driver for the Black community and a major source of doctoral and postdoctoral training for students of color. Keep in mind that our program choice of choosing an HBCU or non-HBCU institution is driven by a long arc of history, as well as personal choices. And then finally, and just kind of keep in mind that there are lots of resources for us to draw upon to fund this type of training, and there are frameworks to use to evaluate the effectiveness and comprehensiveness of the fellowship training of your choice. And so we'll move on to the other speakers, and I'll be available for questions concerning this topic at the end of the talk. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Harris-Love. That was a wonderful introduction and a good segue into the next phase of this presentation. So I'm going to be talking about the value of PhD training more specifically. And can you all see my screen here?
Yes, I see it.
Perfect. And when I say PhD training, this is meant to be representative of other forms of, whether it's an EED or a PsyD or a DSI. There's lots of terminal degrees that are equivalent or roughly equivalent, depending on the program and the goals of to a PhD. So PhD is kind of a broad umbrella. So for purposes of introduction, I'm Jennifer Stevens-Lapsley, and I'm at the University of Colorado as well in the physical therapy program. And I'm also the director of the Rehabilitation Science PhD program. I've had a lot of experience with other PhD programs, both personally, directly and indirectly, from which I have formed the basis of the recommendations and the highlights that I will share with you today. All right, so starting out, because Mike Body is going to talk a little bit more about residency fellowship opportunities, but just to kind of highlight the differences between residency fellowship and PhD training, when you look broadly at residency fellowship goals, typically individuals ultimately are interested in management or clinical roles, or becoming a clinical expert and specializing in a particular patient population, or developing case studies on individual patients where you're following an individual patient and observing kind of unique treatment and outcomes. And those are all really important. Our profession absolutely needs people to be invested in those types of roles through residency fellowship training. I'm going to be talking more about PhD training, which allows for a wider door to open to become a professor in academia. It's not the only way to be a professor in academia, but I'll share a little bit of information along those lines as well. Allows you to really change and advance clinical practice on a larger scale. So conducting large scale funded clinical research on population and systems levels, or even if you're in the classroom educating, advancing clinical practice by educating the next generation of clinicians. So you have a much wider reach ultimately than at the individual patient level. Again, both are really important, and we need both in our profession. So when individuals come to me thinking about the possibility of PhD training, there are a number of considerations that typically come to the forefront of their minds. And so I thought I'd highlight a few of those. The first is financial, and I'm going to go into much more detail from a financial standpoint in a few slides. So I'll save that piece. It's certainly an important consideration, as Dr. Harislov highlighted. The funding models for graduate education are different than undergraduate, but there's still some other additional considerations that I'll share with you. But the other one that individuals speak to is the fatigue of being in the classroom. So the thought of going from your undergraduate to your PT degree to then going on to additional graduate education results in a lot of people kind of hesitating because of classroom fatigue. And so what I tell individuals from this standpoint is either take a break from your DPT education before you enter the PhD program, or pick a PhD program that has less classroom didactic components, meaning some programs have a lot more course credit hours that are required for that PhD than others. Some have a more practical, hands-on kind of approach. I will say that our program was designed with that in mind, where you have almost half the number of credits of some programs, because we really wanted people in the classroom, I should say, we really wanted individuals to learn by doing, through excellent mentorship and in really productive research labs and environments. And so in our program, for example, you're really only in class for the first year and a half, maybe 2 years, and it's part-time classroom. So it's really, 10 hours a week plus some activities related to that coursework. And so the rest of your time is spent doing research or in some programs teaching, getting experience with in the classroom early on. The other hesitation that people have often with DPT or going straight from a PT to PhD program, or even with a break, is losing that clinical component. So they really enjoy being in the classroom, and individuals speak to wanting to still maintain contact with patients. And I can tell you that that's just a matter of finding clinical projects and clinical labs where you still interact with patients. Many of our students treat patients as part of clinical studies that are part of our clinical research program. So they keep their hand in clinical activities while getting their PhD. And then the other consideration is that students talk about balance in terms of work-life balance. And I'll be the first to say that an academic environment is one that often increases the total volume of work that you could engage in. So it's a little bit different than patient care in the sense that when you're done and you're done with your notes, you're done. There's always more that can be done. And it's a matter of figuring out that work-life balance, no matter what career path, no matter what track you choose. I will say that a lot of academics will speak to the fact that they do probably put in more hours than they would as a clinician, but they get a lot of joy and satisfaction from the types of things they're doing because they have a lot of autonomy and they have a lot of opportunities to really choose the things that they want to be doing. And so that increases the feeling of satisfaction, which inherently, no matter how many hours you work, increases the likelihood of having balance in your life. So to set the stage for an important aspect of getting a PhD, will there be a job when you conclude your training? There's no question that the job market is there for individuals who are PhD trained, whether it's research emphasis or whether it's teaching or combination of both. The number of positions that are available or that are going to be available continues to grow, both because of retirements and the opening of additional programs. And so there's no question that the job market is very good for individuals who are PhD trained. In fact, I would say that what's interesting to note is that, well, I'll actually come back to a specific statistic. I'll share this slide with you first. This is the number of individuals who are doctorally trained with a PhD or a professional doctorate of another type, which are listed. And CAPD has mandated that programs have 50% of their faculty with terminal degrees of this nature, either the Doctor of Philosophy or equivalent. And so that is encouraging programs to hire individuals with PhDs because they have to meet that requirement. And as a result, we're seeing that, again, the job market for those trained with PhD is exceptionally good right now. Now, an interesting piece of information, because you can get a faculty position without a PhD, but we, many years ago at the University of Colorado, looked at the number of applicants we had for individuals who were DPT trained with a clinical specialist certification of some sort versus PhD trained for two different positions. One was intended to be PhD trained, more of a research track, and one was intended to be appropriate for someone with a DPT without that background. And we had an 8-fold increase in the number of applicants for a PT position that didn't require a PhD compared to one that did. So you absolutely can get hired into a PT program without a PhD, but it's much more competitive. And so it's just something to think about. So I would imagine the large majority of you have some familiarity with the types of things that a professor does. But just to kind of provide some context, I think one of the things that people enjoy about being in academia is the variety of different things that are possible. So you can be involved in research, in clinical work, in service, and in teaching. And at different points in your career, you can have a different amount of each of those representative elements that are part of your, essentially your academic portfolio. And so it allows for a lot of movement in and out of these different roles and a lot more variety. Now, what I'm going to share with you next is a cost analysis that we did. I want to thank Alex Garbin, who really helped spearhead a lot of this cost analysis, as well as Sherry Ledoux, who initially set the stage for some of this work, and other colleagues, including Mike Body, who you will hear from next. And what we did was look at what are the costs associated with getting a PhD, and does it pay off in the long run? So one of the biggest barriers to PhD training is the financial piece. Individuals have debt from their undergraduate training, from their DPT training, and now the thought of going back and getting a PhD when they're already in debt is overwhelming. And the first thing I'll tell you is that most PhD programs do offer a stipend, especially if you go to a full-time program. You get paid a stipend for engaging in that educational experience, in addition to having your health insurance typically paid for, and your fees and other costs. Now, the stipend isn't huge, but it at least prevents you from incurring additional debt in most cases. So we did some modeling, and this was with 2019 data. This was CAPTI data, our accreditation body, that has salary data for our profession, along with some other data from different sources. We assumed for your PhD with $30,000 per year stipend. I'll tell you that varies by program. Our stipend here at the University of Colorado is now $34,000 and expected to increase again next year. So this 2019 data is probably the most representative data of the concepts that I'm going to share with you, given the changes that we saw with COVID. And we also made an assumption with the modeling that in some cases, individuals did a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship. So Dr. Harris-Love mentioned a postdoc or a fellowship, and often these fellowships are after your PhD training, and they can be typically around 2 years. They have a higher stipend, but because the job market is so attractive, many individuals are able to get a job if they want one directly after their PhD training. The other assumption that I should mention is we have modeled these trajectories based on the assumption that there are no additional scholarships. So individuals earn $30,000 a year and that's it. And there's no additional scholarships available, when in fact, the large majority of our students do get a number of additional scholarships. So like the Foundation for Physical Therapy offers up to $45,000 in additional income over 4 years of PhD training. And there's additional scholarships through the APTA sections or the National Institutes of Health or various different foundations that our students have been successful at applying for. So this is kind of like the worst case scenario. It's also assuming no outside clinical work as well. The salaries are converted to total compensation. So we have included benefits and in our projections. And we've compared total compensations between a clinical PT, someone who has not sought out an academic position, and academic positions. And within academic, we have PhD trained or equivalent and non-PhD trained. I will mention that the differences are adjusted to present value to represent that cash flow today is more valuable than future identical cash flow down the road. And that may be, I'm happy, I won't go into a lot of detail there, but it's basically assuming that the money that you have today is more valuable than money that you get in 10 years. So it also reflects a conservative estimate in terms of these projections. So in terms of looking at the data, as far as earning potential, does the PhD pay off? Well, these data, you can see here, the PhD training is represented down here in the 4-year time frame. And then we have academic, I'll start with actually the clinical PT, which is in purple here. So a clinical PT is going to immediately upon conclusion of their DPT training, they're going to get a job as a clinician. And you can see their earning potential here. This is again, salary plus benefits. And you can see it increases at different intervals depending on promotion opportunities along the way. An academic PhD PT is in, actually, let me do the green next. The academic non-PhD PT. This is an individual who has a DPT and usually is a specialist in orthopedics or neurologic PT or some subdiscipline. And you can see in green their earning potential, which is higher than the individuals that have a DPT that work clinically. In blue, you'll see an academic PhD PT. So this blue teal color, you'll see that after getting the PhD, where there's a deficit in terms of earning potential compared to their peers, there's a substantial increase in earning potential upon assuming their role as an assistant professor, and then an additional increase as an associate professor and an additional increase as a full professor. And so you can see this would be someone who would be typically, they have a PhD, but they are not engaged in research as kind of the majority of their efforts. So CAPTE defines and divides, kind of draws the line at 50% or more research scholarship, then you're considered majority scholarship. So these are individuals who are largely teaching, but maybe engaged in some very meaningful research as well, but have wear predominantly a hat that's weighted more towards teaching. The last one that I'll mention here is the pink, the academic majority scholarship. And what you'll see here is that those individuals we've modeled to have 4 years of PhD training plus a 2-year postdoctoral training experience, and then they go on to get their position as an assistant professor. And you can see the trajectory of their earning potential as it goes up here over time. So bottom line is, do you break even though? And when do you break even? Hopefully these graphs, you can see that getting a PhD certainly lends itself to a large earning potential if you're not doing it too late in your career. Because what you see here is we've compared these lines or these outputs to someone with a clinical degree, again, the DPT that's practicing in a clinical environment. So in blue, it's clinical versus PhD. So that's the largely teaching line. Where individuals did not go and do that extra postdoctoral fellowship. So they break even 16 years after they start their PhD, so 12 years after they finish their PhD. And the individuals who have clinical plus majority PhD scholarship do that additional postdoctoral fellowship, so it takes them a little longer to break even, but you can see that the earning potential as they continue is much greater in the long run. And so when you look at the actual amounts over time, those total to, for the DPT trained individual, the loss you can see here in blue in terms of lost income, and in the research PhD, you can see the loss there, but you can see the earning potential in the long run listed here in terms of the return on the investment and the net gain over time. And again, this is modeled over 30 years. So if individuals are out practicing for 20 years and then they go back and get their PhD, the return on the investment isn't going to be quite as great as if they went back to get their PhD earlier. The other thing I like to highlight, and is really important for people to recognize, is that the federal government will pay off 100% of your federal student loans. You can't consolidate your loans to be eligible. And this includes your undergraduate and your graduate loans. And so if you're competitive and you go to an institution for PhD training that has a rigorous research program, in competitive meaning you're productive, you're able to hit certain benchmarks, you are very likely to be eligible for one of these programs. And so that's something to consider, because a lot of students come back to me after working and they say, I had to pay off all my loans before I could go back and consider getting a PhD. And so trying to spread the word that no, you should have the federal government pay your loans off, get the PhD earlier in your career so that you don't have to pay those loans off. There are also public service loan forgiveness programs, which require 10 years of employment with the US. And those I won't spend as much time on, but they don't kick in quite as early as the loan repayment program, which some of our PhD students have been eligible for because they have a DPT while they're in their PhD training. So they kick in a little bit sooner. There are additional financial opportunities in academia to narrow the gap, the investment in the education. There are consulting opportunities. There are patents and royalties if you produce something that ends up being lucrative in that capacity. Paid travel opportunities to conferences or other networking opportunities. Sometimes paid editorial board memberships or continuing education opportunities. So there's more than just the academic salary that can be considered. However, I always tell people, do not consider getting a PhD just for the money. The reason that I present these data and the reason we undertook this analysis was to really start to be able to answer the question of what are the financial payoffs? Does it pay off in the long run or not? And based on our projections and the information that we have, we can more confidently state that in most cases, it does pay off in the long run, even without getting a loan repayment grant or something that further sweetens the deal in terms of getting PhD. So what doors open with a PhD? Well, there's a number of doors. And so it's not just the financial benefits, it's the opportunity to advance and sustain our profession, the intellectual stretching and challenge that are present in our work every day, tremendous flexibility. I can flex my schedule and time, not around patient care activities, but around the things that are important to me and my family. Professional connectedness. So having a network, an academic network, is much smaller than you might think, and usually that's works to your advantage. As well as I mentioned, travel and professional networking opportunities. And one of the things that I particularly am passionate about is mentoring the next generation of physical therapists. So having the opportunity to kind of impact and grow the next generation of individuals who are going to shape the future of our profession. I get a lot of questions about what are the characteristics of successful PhD candidates, and there's 4 listed here. Perseverance and tenacity. You have to be able to kind of stick with something, and you have to be willing to accept criticism. Grants and papers come back with people who don't like your ideas, and you have to really be able to go back at it and say, all right, I'm going to try again. The other one is cogency. So the ability to clearly articulate your ideas in person, whether it's presenting something or in writing. Writing is a critical skill for success in a research capacity in academia, especially. The other one on the list is self-discipline, because there's a lot of unstructured time during PhD training. And so having an open-ended schedule and being able to structure it accordingly is really important. Very different from DPT curriculum where you're scheduled from hour to hour and with intermediate deadlines that kind of hold you accountable. And then the last one on the list is natural inquisitiveness. You really have to be someone who's always asking the next question, is curious about, well, how can you do this better? Or what could you be doing as an alternative in order to be successful? There are a number of PhD programs out there. There's over 60 programs when I looked earlier this week, and specific to rehab science or rehab science related disciplines. And so you'll see here websites and links for looking at some of those programs to see which programs are in areas that you live in, or which programs are in areas where you'd want to consider relocating. I also get asked a lot of questions about what to look for in a PhD program, and I'll run through these quickly so that we have time. We make sure we have time for Dr. Body's very informative information on residency fellowship training. But I always emphasize that the research should match your interests, but understanding the research process may be more important than finding an exact match with a population that you might be interested in. For example, if you're interested in pediatrics, There's nothing wrong with studying under someone who's invested in clinical research questions that are focused on geriatrics. If you want to learn how to run a clinical trial, it doesn't matter whether it's geriatrics or pediatrics. And if you want to learn how to write a manuscript or a grant, it's still going to give you the same skill set. So sometimes finding the right mentor at the right institution is far more important than just the population that you're studying. If you're someone who's tired of being in the classroom, avoid programs with excessive coursework. If you like classroom didactic content, then find one that has more coursework. Look for a program with a history of students getting funded. I mean, history repeats itself. And so look for programs that have had a track record of getting students funded. Look for a program within an institution that's large enough to support a variety of collaborations. So a lot of times I've found that students' interests change during the course of their PhD training. And so if they're at an institution where that allows for that growth and change, that allows the student to adapt and pursue some of those alternative interests. And then even if you're pursuing a PhD focused on research, make sure you get some teaching experience because you're going to end up teaching in the classroom. What to look for in a PhD program? Well, there's full-time and part-time considerations. Full-time program is going to allow you to finish sooner. It's going to have paid tuition, health insurance typically, more productivity in terms of publications and grants. There's a clear demarcation in students that I've seen that do part-time versus full-time in terms of their overall productivity, which ultimately makes people more competitive for these scholarships like the loan repayment grant. Part-time allows you to work clinically though. So, we had an individual who owned their own practice. And so working and getting a PhD part-time instead of giving up their clinical practice made a lot of sense. Usually tuition, health insurance are unpaid. And again, you may not be as competitive for things like the loan repayment programs. What to look for in a PhD mentor, their experience, their productivity in terms of publications and things that they've been able to achieve, their grant funding, because if they have funding, they're going to be able to support you. Track record of getting PhD students funded, mentoring style that matches how you work and learn best. I mean, talk to students in the lab, make sure that their experiences reflect the type of environment that you would like to be in, the type of mentoring situation that you would work best in. And then the history of graduates getting desired jobs, although like I said, that has not been a problem with programs across the country more generally. And finally, how do you test the waters or figure out how to get whether or not a PhD is right for you? Really getting some experience and some exposure in a lab is probably the best way to learn whether or not this is the right fit for you, the right track. The last thing that often comes up is the timing. Do you go direct from your DPT to PhD, or do you practice for a little bit and then get your PhD? What's the optimal length of time? And I'll be the first person to say, ideally, you go out and practice for a year or two. The problem is, even if you only say you're going to go out and practice for a year or two, a lot of people never come back because life happens. You have a mortgage on a house, you have kids, you have other things that make it harder to go back. And so we have seen more and more individuals go directly from their DPT to PhD successfully. That's what I did many years ago. And I run a clinical research program that has a heavy emphasis on patient care. And so it is possible, but that gives you kind of a sense of to be thinking about kind of the pros and cons of that trade-off. And so hopefully I've covered a couple of the different considerations that might have come to your mind in terms of considering PhD training. I will be happy to take additional questions. I will turn things over to Mike to round things out with the fellowship residency component of this presentation, and then we'll take all of your questions at the end. Thank you for your attention.
Let's see, can you see my screen then?
Sure can.
All right, thanks. Yeah, and so it's my pleasure today to talk about the value of residency and fellowship training in contrast to PhD doctoral training that Jen spoke about. And just as a quick aside, Jen, myself, as well as Carol Tucker, one of our colleagues, we typically present a longer version of this presentation at CSM. So if you're joining us in San Diego next year, we'll likely be presenting there a longer version as well as a longer Q&A associated with this. So if you're interested, please join us then, as well as we're working with ACAP on producing some better in-depth resources as well too. So please stay tuned. So just as a quick context here today, I'm an associate professor at the University of Colorado. I helped to start the Duke University Manual Therapy Fellowship Program, as well as I'm past director of Regis University's Orthopedic Manual Physical Therapy Fellowship Program. And these days I'm actively involved with our residency programs here at the University of Colorado, which we have pediatrics, faculty, and orthopedics, as well as I'm heavily involved in our PhD program as well too. So I'm a fairly rare individual in the fact that I've gone through both PhD as well as fellowship training. And I have passions for both, and I think both have been outstanding opportunities on my life. And so I'm happy to talk to you today about residency and fellowship training. Fast. Right, there we go. So just first and foremost, sometimes there's some terminology and misunderstanding surrounding residency and fellowship. So in terms of, they have some very similar aspects in terms they both involve very formal didactic and mentorship components. And they're both designed to advance your skills within a focus area of practice. Right? So that's a very broad level of comparison, right? But then if we get into the nitty gritty, oftentimes, so there's specialist certification versus subspecialist certification. Probably the easiest example of that is orthopedics, where I might get my OCS and I specialize in orthopedics, which is a general practice of orthopedics, going from entry level broad general practitioner for our DPT into a specialist in orthopedics. And then I might choose to subspecialize in, which what I did is in orthopedic manual physical therapy, which is a subspecialty within orthopedics. It assumes you have the broad orthopedic knowledge, and now we're going to do a deep dive into a certain aspect of orthopedics. They have very different curricula, given that difference. So DRP is description of residency practice, which is a defined curricula for residencies, and then DFP is description of fellowship practice, which is a defined curricula associated with fellowship programs. Mentor qualifications is something I like to highlight in the fact that a lot of us have clinical education experiences, and where you start CIs have, like we just essentially get the CI that we're assigned from our program a lot of times, whereas in residency and fellowship programs, your mentor needs to have minimum qualifications, such as if you're in an orthopedic residency program, they need to have their OCS. And if you're working in a fellowship program, they actually have to have their subspecialization. So oftentimes the mentor qualification means that you're getting a very high level mentor for your experience within these programs, which is can't be overstated in terms of the importance of them. Residency training prepares you for a culminating certification, whereas fellowship does not, except for in the case of orthopedic manual physical therapy fellowship programs, where you'll be eligible to be a FAM, a fellow of the American Academy of Orthopedic Manual Physical Therapists, as well as there's some differences in admission requirements. After you finish your DPT, you're essentially able to apply to any residency program. However, if you want to get into a fellowship program, typically you're going to need your specialist certification or have completed a residency within that area. There's some minor exceptions, but that's a broad overview. So where are the opportunities in residency and fellowship education? So here's residency graduates by practice area. There's about 350 total residency programs right now, and that number keeps changing every day as more programs come in the pipeline. But I like the number of graduates in the statistics because some programs have one resident or fellow, and some have over 100. And so what's the actual capacity of a certain specialty area? So you can see that orthopedics by far and away has the most number of slots available, or graduates coming out, as well as sports and neurology being followed after that. Then in fellowship areas, the orthopedic manual physical therapy fellowship programs are actually far more predominant in terms of number of graduates. They're actually older than residency programs, which is kind of interesting in terms of how they developed. But overall, here's the total different areas of fellowship practice currently available, and this also changes on a fairly regular basis. So one of the big focus of our presentation today, and this is what I wanted to fine tune mine into, is why would I choose to do a residency or fellowship program? There's a ton of different reasons that you might choose to. First and foremost for me is mentorship. I can remember my fellowship experience and my clinical mentors that I had, fundamentally changed who I am as a clinician and made me, I like to think 10 times better as a clinician. I definitely grew in confidence, my clinical reasoning skills, my ability to help my patients, and in so many different aspects. And there's a host of other reasons as well too. When we think about mentoring though, a lot of us think about that clinical practice element, like, hey, let me think about my patient examination skills, my management skills. Let me think about maybe my psychomotor skill development as well too. But mentorship actually in these programs extends far beyond just those patient management aspects. It also includes components such as leadership, professionalism, Depending on the program, you'll get exposed to research mentorship, eventually teaching mentorship, as well to clinical reasoning, interprofessional and team-based care. So mentorship can really encompass a far range of attributes and to help you develop as a professional in addition to as a clinician. There's also I think a huge advantage is there's a planned curricula associated with each of these programs. So this can really help to elevate your practice and definitely your knowledge base within these defined areas. And so there's different core elements. So just like DPT programs that are regulated by CAPT, ABTRI regulates residency and fellowship programs, and they have certain standards that they're required to meet in terms of core elements for their education, as well as what's unique to these programs when compared to DPT programs is that they actually have defined practice areas and patient populations that you need to work with, and so you need to see a certain number of patients in certain categories, depending upon the residency or fellowship program, which, in DPT programs, it's kind of whatever patient walks through the door, that's who you're treating. But in residency and fellowship programs, there's a higher bar in terms of, you need to have exposure to these certain subpopulations or practice settings. So that's quite a contrast compared to DPT programs. I'd also say that there's actually, just to go back to this, there's actually quite a variety, just like in DPT programs. Certainly, although we all have the same educational standards part of this, I'd say there's a wide breadth of different approaches to how we teach in DPT curricula, same as with residency and fellowship programs. And so this is one of the areas I heavily look at when I'm considering residency and fellowship programs. How do they actually design their curriculum? What format is it in? That's becoming more and more of a focus these days. There's a lot more hybrid programs coming online or fully online for the most part for educational components. So that format and how its pure content is delivered, as well as how they design it. Some programs actually build theirs all in-house. Some programs outsource it through companies like Midbridge. And so you see a very wide variety of how programs put together their curriculum. So this is an area to in particular focus on when you're looking at different programs and how they actually implement this. So what does it actually look like on a day-to-day basis? So this is an example from BU's neuro residency program. In terms of, you can see this individual has about 32 hours a week of clinical practice, which is about a 3/4 load, which would be very common for a reduced clinical hour cost paradigm. And so I'll talk about costs a little bit later in the presentation. But you can see that they're rounding in the morning. They have clinical practice. They have defined blocks within the week for their clinical mentorship experiences, where typically your clinical mentor is scheduling in patients that they think will help to advance and drive your clinical reasoning that they might think you have a challenge with, as well as typically you're also able to schedule in your own patients into those blocks where you're having a problem with as well too. So you can really seek mentorship on those individuals that you really need help with as well too. So it's really nice to have those defined blocks. You might have additional learning experiences, like in this case, like webinars or journal club, educational in-services, specialty clinics. This individual is doing some teaching and research on Fridays as well too. And then you can see on Saturday and Sunday, in this case, they're flying to LA. This is because they're doing the Neuro Consortium has a curricula that they put together that neurologic residency programs can utilize. And so this individual will be flying in to undergo that educational process on a quarterly basis. So overall, a very diverse schedule that occurs and very designed to elevate your practice level to that of an expert in that area. So a big question is, well, so will I become a better clinician, right, when I go through these programs? That's a really hard concept to really get your hands around, because ultimately I'd say, well, how good a clinician are you today? How do you actually define that metric, right? Is it my outcome scores? Is it my patient satisfaction scores? Is it overall, like the combination of those two? How do we weigh those? And ultimately, like very few PT practices really do a good job of tracking outcomes across all patient populations, so you can compare yourself to your fellow therapists, let alone across different programs or different hospital systems as well too. And so it's really hard to find data to support the impact of residency and fellowship training. I think maybe one of the better, more recent studies I've seen is by Winslow and colleagues shown here, where they actually were looking at the patient-specific functional scale, something they did with all their patients prior to the initiation of a residency program. So they'd say, hey, what is our average change in patient-specific functional scale scores for all our patients prior to pre-residency training? Then they implement their residency. They're following over time to see how things are going after post-residency. and a later time point as well too, where resident graduates retained as staff and existing staff are finding their skills. And you can see a nice upward trend of their change in PSFS scores. Now, along with getting better outcomes, according to their patients on this one outcome tool, they also noted that they actually had increased productivity, not same, but actually increased their productivity simultaneously while developing or delivering better outcomes, as well as they subjectively described the creation of a culture of excellence, which is something that I noted within my own fellowship program, is that there is a certain passion for delivering high quality care that's contagious. And as your fellow clinicians are really driving themselves to become the best clinicians they can, I feel that's pretty contagious, and it builds a highly collaborative and supportive environment where people are really trying to produce the best outcome for the patients. And so creating that culture is something that's quite unique as well too. That's hard to define. What do graduates perceive if you just ask them directly, in terms of what did you get out of this program? And so Smith did the survey. It's a little bit dated, but I think I bet it would probably ring pretty true today as well too, talking to our residency graduates as well too. A large number of graduates have a major positive impact on our patient management skills in our clinical exam, clinical reasoning processes, efficiency, effectiveness, ability to diagnose, treat complex patients. It really helps me to do those better. You'll also see like career interest and fulfillment goes up as well too, which I think speaks to a little bit that culture of excellence that created in these programs. As well as your confidence goes up and you really feel like you're helping your patients better. I do think that kind of has a nice supportive impact on your overall perception of your career and your fulfillment within physical therapy. In terms of how it might impact your professional development and leadership in other areas, such as Jen was talking about earlier in terms of coming into being a professor within academia, if we look at residency versus non-residency trained PTs, as Jones did in 2008. They looked at how many were participating in fellowship programs, got board certified, served as CI, and residency training had a huge impact on people's involvement in those activities, as well as a fair number of people had a higher proportion of individuals who went on to participate as an instructor or coordinate a course within a PT program, or serve as a faculty member within a residency and fellowship program. So it can open some doors into some of these other professional areas of your career. All right, and then we do know for sure, this is something that's tracked very closely by ABTRI is how many people pass their exam on the first time for their specialist certification. Across the board, it's about a 16% increase in first time pass rate. And these are quite expensive exams to take and take a lot of preparation. They're offered only once a year. And so first time pass is something that's very important to a lot of people. You definitely don't want to go through this multiple times. I can tell you, I've gone through mine. I would not want to go through multiple times. However, you can see that in certain practice areas, there's quite a bit of boost in terms of your overall pass rate. Like if you look at orthopedics, 481 people took that test. And this is in 2020, 67% who are non-residency passed it versus 86% who were residency graduates passed it. So we do know that because of that structured curriculum, it does give you an advantage in taking these board certification examinations as well too. Another big question I get is, because there's a cost associated with residency and fellowship training, which we'll talk about later, is, well, will this allow me to get paid more? Jen had a really nice study in terms of looking at how salaries are impacted by PhD training and coming onto academia. There's only a handful of studies that have really looked at this question. Again, it's a little bit tricky to try and track in residency and fellowship graduates. The most recent one was by Whitman in 2020, where they saw that on average, the pay increased by about $10,000 for their fellowship graduates. Jones in 2008, probably about a $6,000 differential in resident salary. And Smith, they had the survey that said a majority perceived a positive impact on residency training on promotion, salary, and job opportunities. It's a little bit hard, especially for clinicians, because ultimately we're still reimbursed for on a procedural model as opposed to a quality model until we shift to a care quality-based model where you're actually reimbursed more on your outcomes as opposed to the units of care that you provide. This is why it's hard to see a big boost in your salary, because you don't fill more units, right, as a residency or a fellowship graduate. You might be more efficient and effective or efficient in your care, and so you might be able to see more patients and thus potentially bill more. However, you're still paid the same per unit in terms of outcomes. And so I think that's why you see less of an impact with residency and fellowship training versus PhD training. But what I will say, no matter what, just like Jen said, caution, making more money shouldn't be your only motivation for doing this. You will definitely gain experience and confidence within that practice area, which can be a huge advantage for some areas that are really competitive, like especially like sports and pediatrics. They're very hard to get into. And so this can give you a year of experience and professional connections, which can really make the difference in terms of your ability to get jobs in your targeted practice area. There's a whole host of other considerations that go into, why would I do the residency and fellowship program besides the benefits I highlighted? Oftentimes when I'm mentoring DPT students or practicing physical therapists who are asking about, is this really the right opportunity for me? The first question I always ask them is this really the right time for you in your life and what's going on? Are you starting a family? Are you ready to spend a little bit more time? Because typically it's going to be more than a full-time clinician job in terms of effort. Is this really the right time in your life and career to do this opportunity? I don't think there's any right or wrong time to do this. I've worked with individuals who've gone through my fellowship program in the past, had 2 years of experience to 30 years of experience. So a huge range. And, I asked all of them, how did you perceive this program? When did you get out of what you wanted to get out of it? And, even the 30-year-old graduate, it's like, yes, this is like a huge impact to my career at this time point. And so I think anytime you undergo a rigorous curriculum and mentoring experience and really are forced to examine how you practice, you have tremendous growth from that. And that can positively impact you as a clinician, regardless of the point in time you choose to undergo education. There's a whole host of other ones. I'm probably just going to touch on 2 for time here today, because these are big questions: is cost and competitiveness. So cost, there's really 2 basic models that you see. One is a reduced salary model, and that's the BU clinician that I showed you that's working 32 hours a week. But if you're only billing 32 hours a week of patient care, then many organizations are like, well, we're going to pay you for 32-hour weeks. So it's a 3/4 salary, if you will. And so that'd be a very common model. Some are just tuition models where it's like, hey, you can work full time and then do this on top of your full-time job, and we'll just charge you a tuition for that. And that tuition in 2020, the median tuition was about $5,000 for a residency program. But the range is quite large, from anywhere from $0 up to $26,560, right? So there's quite a range. I have seen practice organizations cover, or the military as well, to cover your costs for attending these programs, because some of them are hybrid that allow you to still practice in one area of the country and undergo your residency and fellowship training while still practicing for that organization that it doesn't offer that. And this might be a way that they can retain you as an employee by offering you this kind of employee benefit and pay for your tuition. So I have seen individuals successful in that. You can also defer your loans, as well as get some discounts on like student memberships. But then be aware that there's some, just some things to be aware of. Some companies do cut your benefits a little bit slightly. And so be aware if there's any changes to your benefit structure, as well as if they cover your dues or not. Some require that, some don't, and some support that. Some have additional outside continuing education requirements, as well as travel requirements as well too. So just be aware of the full cost associated with the program. In terms of competitiveness, there's a lot of programs that are really hard to get into, especially like I'd say pediatrics and sports are known to have way more applicants than actual slots available. Orthopedics has more than enough slots, but some programs, like the Ohio State University, they're extremely competitive to get into. And so I think regardless of the specialty you're going into, some of these programs can be really competitive to get into. So I would just say, do your homework prior to contacting anyone at that program, and really be able to, talk to that director if you're able to, or someone within the program with very specific questions, such that it looks like you're prepared and not just asking general information that's found on the website. Having very solid recommendations from your CE clinical instructors right now at this time point, your professors in this area, colleagues who subspecialize or specialize within these areas. There's opportunities to meet the directors. So there are like virtual fairs within the different specialties, as well as opportunities at CSM, as well as many directors will encourage you to visit the program. And however, some are also, they don't like that because they think it biases them in their application process. So just feel free to contact those individuals and see if that's possible. Excel in your education, I think that goes without saying. as well as show that you're ready for the program by mastering the basics within that and being able to accept feedback and growth from that. Finally, the last little trick is if you don't get in on the first try, I have known quite a few individuals who've just gone to work for that organization and then been very successful getting the residency spot for next year as that organization has got to know you as a clinician. And many residency directors would rather take someone they know very well rather than gamble on someone that they don't know, right? And so that's a very nice way if you don't get in the first round to your preferred organization. Here's some resources for you. ACAP has a nice overview page, as well as AbTree is a great place to go for just general information. And RFPTCast is where you go to apply for a majority of programs, as well as AAMP is a good resource as well too here, which is more fellowship. Some references, and we'll end. Let's see on this last slide, although I think we'll stop share because I think we're right at time. So we'll open it up for questions at this time point.
Yeah, feel free to type questions in the chat. There's certainly been a good some comments in the chat, but also feel free to take yourself off mute and ask us a question directly. I think there was a comment about, I think we covered it a little bit. There was a comment about total compensation, how many hours for full-time, I think. And I know the Scott Richardson, you made a comment about 80 hours plus for a faculty member. Is that what you were referring to? I don't know too many faculty members that work 80 hours a week. I would say the average that we've seen is probably more like 50 up to 60, but I don't know too many that are working more than that. And again, I always tell people it's a matter of what do you enjoy doing, and is your faculty position structured with the things that you enjoy doing such that it doesn't feel like quite as many hours. But certainly your point is well taken. Academia does lend itself. There's always more to do than there are than other avenues like clinical practice, although there's always opportunities in clinical practice to go above and beyond as well. Mike, there's a question about sports residencies.
Yeah, so I mean, sports residencies are a unique animal in terms of that they're quite competitive. There are also admission requirements. I didn't want to get into the nitty-gritty about different admission requirements, but you will need, an EMT or some sort of certification ATC that will enable you to do on the field sports management, right? So there are some other additional credentials that are definitely requirements for you getting into those programs. And so sports section does have an EMT program that's specific to this that you can go through. I guess it's the Academy of Sports now as well too. Additional certifications, I do think that they do increase your competitive edge. That's why, a lot of residency directors I talk to, they do prefer, if they have a choice between someone who's been, this is actually interesting, someone who's been practicing for a little while and has additional certifications behind them and experience within that area versus someone who's a new grad and maybe has less certifications, less experience. Some residency directors, I'll say, well, that they really like the more, quote unquote, mature candidate who has more experience as well as additional certifications that are really relevant to that practice area. Others will say, I really like the new grad because they have less, preconceived notions about how to actually treat, and they're more moldable in some ways. And so this is, I think, comes down to a little bit of the residency director. I do think they offer a slight advantage in the fact that you have more broad experience and beyond just your DPT education. However, I would take, solid recommendations any day over additional certifications. Like some of those, like CSCS, you can get that in a weekend. And, I'm pretty sure I could not study for that test and pass it right now. And that's not to, downplay that degree. I have a lot of sports conditioning experience, but I'm just saying how hard is that certification to get? And so, oftentimes I'll be very particular about weighing the value that certification adds personally above and beyond a DPT education as well too, and solid experience with me.
Hey, I have a question for Jen. So you spoke a lot in your talk about getting jobs for PhDs in academia, but I was wondering if you've had any students or colleagues leverage their PhDs into getting jobs in industry or the private sector, and what sorts of opportunities are out there in that realm for PhDs in our area.
Yeah, that's a great question. In other disciplines, PhD training kind of lends itself to more of a split between industry and academia because the job market's more competitive for academia. But yes, you absolutely can get a job with industry. I know someone who works for Nike, looking at biomechanics, or used to work for Nike, looking at biomechanics and running and applying some of their training accordingly. I also see individuals getting jobs in healthcare systems more recently. So instead of just a traditional academic route, they're often still affiliated with an academic institution, but they might be the director of research of a large healthcare system. And so that's an alternative pathway. So the academic route is not the only route. And I'm glad you asked that question because it's a very good point to emphasize. I will say that the large majority of our graduates across the country end up in academic positions just because there's so many openings available. So it almost is the path of least resistance, but it's certainly not a limiting factor by any means.
Just a follow-up question real quick. Do you find that people who are, or individuals who are interested in that pathway have an easier or difficult time breaking into that market after receiving a PhD?
To be very honest, the only individuals I know that have gone that route have been in academia first and then have gone that route. So I don't have a lot of experience with how easy it is to break into the market. I don't know, Mike or Michael, if you have any experiences. I think it's just a matter of what your area of specialization is, and is there a niche that is like the biomechanics? I mean, Nike's interested in developing shoes with the right absorption and the right biomechanics kind of principles to optimize performance. So in that particular case, it was a great fit for this individual. Mike or Michael, do you have any experience with individuals who've gone more of the industry route?
It's some. I mean, there's some folks that work in my area of neuromuscular disease and that type of thing who have joined forces with pharmaceutical companies. And so that's been one avenue. And there's a wide variety of advanced degrees that are helpful in that regard, like clinical research nursing to physical therapy and just the DPT without the PhD. So I don't think you need that to get in there, but certainly it's helpful depending on your role in that researcher team.
Yeah, it depends on, in that case, whether they're looking for truly that clinical experience or whether you need to be trained to do research and have the clinical experience. But that's a really good point. You could probably get into some of those circles without a PhD.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. It's a reminder that I probably should include that in the presentation. That's not the only path. It just is the most common path that we've seen. Any other thoughts or questions before we part? We're happy to certainly be a resource and remain available for questions as you consider your career options down the road. Certainly always open to feedback with respect to any of the information we've shared with you. But any other questions before we break?
Not seeing any in the chat. I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
I think I have one. Do you have any information, anybody have any information on people who may choose to get a PhD that's not totally related to the DPT or rehab sciences? Like it may be healthcare administration or, something that is not, totally related to the DPT or rehab.
Yeah, I think it's a very viable option. I think it's just because you bring your clinical experience and then you add that healthcare administration piece, and you have two different lenses that you're looking through. The other one that I've seen is more of like a health policy slant. There's lots of different kind of PhDs and hats. I mean, you can also get a PhD in psychology and still apply it to rehab. So there's a lot of different kind of representation that I think would be meaningful. And I wouldn't discourage anyone from going outside of the kind of the traditional norms of rehab science and going into some of those other disciplines, because we need more physical therapists at the table to represent us in those other circles. So I think it's very valuable. I don't know if Mike or Michael have other additional comments.
I thought you addressed that well. I did want to touch base on the one comment that's in the chat, and this will be for any of us to feel, but they're really talking about the work-life balance and going through a program, starting a family, the issue of gender and sex, and there are different perspectives here. Of course, Jen has a family. My wife and I both got advanced doctorates, so that's his own story. And then my body probably has some thoughts here as well. Jen, did you want to start, with your perspective
Sure.
of family and study?
Yeah, I think that having kids while you're getting your PhD is certainly not an insignificant additional kind of balancing act, right? At the early days, the early years of dealing with an infant or young kids and trying to complete your PhD training is certainly something to be weighed and considered, but it's not impossible. We have certainly a number of our students who are women who are new moms and men who have had kids, their spouses have had kids, and they've been successful. They've been able to achieve the goals and the targets. Obviously, the women are taking some time off, but sometimes the men are also taking some time off and balancing out the responsibilities. So my perspective has always been that it is absolutely doable, but there has to be a balanced roles and responsibilities within your family unit, your spouse, if you're female, is willing to take on some of the caregiver responsibilities, and that there's really a sharing of some of those responsibilities. And that's where I've seen that be very successful and very doable. So I guess that would be my kind of short take. I had kids when I was an assistant professor at the University of Colorado, so not while I was in my PhD training. But again, we've had students who've been PhD students or postdoctoral fellows who have been very successful in juggling the responsibilities. One of my former PhD students said that she became much more focused and much more efficient because you learn very quickly, you have a finite amount of time. And unlike when you didn't have kids where you could just put in a couple extra hours here and there, you realize you can't. And so all of a sudden you become laser focused on, I got to get this done. And so there are definitely strategies along those lines that I've seen students become more efficient, or at least be able to maintain their level of productivity in those early days.
Yeah, I mean, we've had even multiple, not who are now faculty, but were PhD students when they had twins, right? And very young parents, but not just a kid, but multiple kids.
That is not recommended.
Several PhD students pregnant, one who just gave birth a little while. We definitely see it all the time. It's definitely very possible. I'd actually say that PhD training is and having young kids is more approachable than trying to do residency and fellowship in some ways, because the clinic schedule has a lot of rigidity to it, right? You have your scheduled block patient care, and it doesn't have a lot of flexibility in it, as well as oftentimes you're going above and beyond a typical clinical week as well. So it's a pretty large ask. PhD training is about a similar amount of time, I'd say, overall on average. However, it has a lot more flexibility built into it. Today I got to take off from the middle of the day, just to go pick up my kids from school really quick, and that was easy for me to do, and then come back here and get ready for this presentation. Sure, I'm working tonight a little bit later, but I'll make up that time later today, but I have flexibility to do that. And so I think that's one thing that's nice about PhD training, as well as academia in general, has a lot more flexibility than the clinic schedule, which tends to be very hard to, if you have to suddenly break away for something, like last minute, which happens a lot with younger family members.
Yeah, I'll just chime in that, these life choices have significant cost, and it's really worth reflecting on. My wife and I basically delayed parenting for about 10 years. We were married 10 years before we had our child. And so we took turns with her getting the PhD first and then me getting an advanced doctorate afterwards. We lived in an expensive city, so there had to be at least one income in the house while we did that. She had a nominal stipend, as Dr. Stevens-Lapsley referred to, but it was strategic, took planning and took sacrifice to make it work. I would probably say that the sacrifice was worth it. I think my wife has a different view, having been an academic for several years now and also a parent. I also find myself now at the age where I'm ready to, move on, and I have a kid still in high school. So, now I have to deal with those costs too. But, I think we're in a better place as a family, both economically and career-wise, for having done that. But there's always pros and cons to this.
There's no one path. I think that life choices shouldn't stand in the way ultimately of career choices. But I think considering and weighing kind of what Mike mentioned, residency, fellowship versus PhD training, and what Dr. Harris-Love mentioned about the of the cost issues are all things that people have to seriously consider. You have to be able to pay your mortgage. You have to be able to pay the daycare bills. You have to, be able to do certain things to sustain and make it work. But I've seen it work in a variety of different capacities, and there's no one road.
All right. It's a great question. We could have a separate talk just on life, family balance, and study on its own, I think.
I will say I gave a talk a number of years ago at our combined sections meeting about women in science that spoke to this particular issue. And one of the strategies I recommended was from a balancing of parenting responsibilities is to go on a trip. Take a trip when your kids are young, and it will inherently teach that balance, whether you're taking the primary role as a caregiver or not. And my husband became very adept at handling the day-to-day operations of that I had been handling with the kids. And it was eye-opening in a very positive way. And it increased the appreciation for the dual roles and the shared responsibilities that we both have with parenting. So there are lots of little tricks and tips along the way. I think you can learn to be successful in managing and navigating young children. I think we're at the end of our allotted time, if I understood the targeted timeline. If there aren't any other questions, again, we are more than happy to be available for questions down the road, and certainly reach out to us if we can be of assistance.
Great. Yeah, thank you all.